Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kirby and Kirk and Raphael, for inviting me to present today. I'm hopeful I can provide some information about impact fees in Texas. I think the way that the state law is written, what I'm going to talk about is applicable to pretty much any city in Texas that would pursue impact fees for their roadways. And then I'll talk a little bit about the specifics of Austin and some of the policy decisions that we are making around the program. So yeah, let's get started. I think Raphael provided a great overview, and so I'll hit on some of the same points. But going to the next slide, I'll just cover the overview quickly of what I want to talk about today. So again, I'll talk about impact fees in Texas and what the law allows, why the city of Austin decided to pursue impact fees for roadways, and what we think some of the benefits are. I'll talk about the study, the specific elements of the study that are required by the state law, how we calculated our fee, and then how that fee is looking that it's going to be set. And then I'll be taking y'all's questions. And if you have questions that come up, the chat will be useful. If I don't get to all of them at the end of the presentation, I can be answering in the chat while we've got our next presenter. So on slide 3, the Texas Local Government Code, Chapter 395 defines impact fees for the state. And impact fees are exactly what Raphael said. It's a charge on new development necessitated and attributable to that new development, right? And it's authorized for water, wastewater, stormwater, and roadway infrastructure. There are other states that allow impact fees for other things, other public services like police or schools, fire service, but we're more on horizontal infrastructure in Texas, and we specifically those. So Austin has had water and wastewater impact fees since the 90s, soon after the statute became law, and then only recently have we started pursuing the roadway infrastructure piece. So on slide 4, I want to talk just a little bit about why we wanted to pursue impact fees before I get into all the details of the study. I mean, initially we had council direction to conduct a study, and really they were interested in a way for development to do a better job of paying for itself or its fair share for the costs of new development. And so we pursued this study, and really the purpose is to develop a method for growth to pay for the infrastructure that's needed to serve it in a way that is equitable across developments. It's more predictable both for the development and for the community. And there's a little bit more transparency behind what the city is requiring and how those funds are being spent on capital projects. So ultimately, our purpose is to determine a fair and reasonable fee that development should pay to provide the capacity improvements needed to serve it. So on the next slide, we have just kind of like what do we see impact fees doing? Encouraging a system that is funding transportation improvements. So that's not to say that we don't do that today, right? We have a development process. We have a land development code that has requirements of development to provide certain transportation elements. And we have transportation impact analysis, or TIAs. A lot of other cities do those as well. But we think that this is a more streamlined way than the process that we have today, which can often result in different outcomes for different developments and neighborhoods, depending on who the stakeholders are, who the developer is, what attorney they hire, all those kind of things, and how the negotiation goes could really provide for different outcomes for development. So we also think they're more fair in a temporal nature for development. So if you were the first development into an area, today, you may end up bearing more of the burden of the infrastructure that is needed because you're the first in, and then the next developer that comes along gets to benefit from the roadway that you built. In this sense, you in a street impact fee, the fee is independent of whether you're the first in or the last in. You're paying specifically your development's impact on the roadway system, just like the next developer, and you're collectively contributing to all of the infrastructure needs within a given area. Impact fees also encourage building of infrastructure, so they can actually incentivize developers to build infrastructure because they can get an offset of their fee for constructing projects. So we're not going to say you build that capital project and you pay your fee. You're going to get credit for constructing that improvement, and a developer may actually be able to build a project at a lower cost than it would cost the city to do later. So that might be actually an incentive for them to go ahead and build it when they're working on their project, which is better for the tenants of that project that now have that infrastructure and aren't waiting for the city to come back around and pay for it later. It's also a more equitable system than what we have now, because all development would be required to contribute proportionally to their impact, whether or not they trigger a transportation impact analysis. In Austin, the trigger for a TIA is development that generates 2,000 trips or more. And so a lot of developments fall under that threshold and aren't doing that more detailed analysis. And that may mean contribute, just proportionately less, or maybe not at all if they're a small enough development. They're not really offsetting their impact to the roadway network. So there are just some motivations and benefits that we see from an impact fee program over what we are doing today. So, yes, go ahead.
Can I ask that TIA threshold? Can you go into a little more depth there? So, do you use a TIA just for mitigation purposes, but it doesn't impact the share that they have to contribute to their impact fees? Is that what you're saying?
It does, right? Yes, it does. So the TIA ends up being used to determine what the mitigation fees a development would pay. We have, in 2017, we updated our land development code to clarify that the city could require mitigation from developments that don't trigger a TIA. And so we have the ability to require mitigation outside of a TIA. However, the majority, I would say, of the mitigation that is being collected from development is through the TIA process. And ultimately, instead of the TIA being focused on what are the transportation improvements that should be done to mitigate impacts and what's going to best benefit that development and the neighborhood, it's a negotiation of how do we pay less, right? Like how, so instead of using it as more of a technical engineering analysis, it's used as more of a development negotiation about how do we get out of paying the city. So what we think is the way that an impact fee would work, they would know what their fee is going to be up front, and then they would be using the TIA to determine how to spend that impact fee. If there are improvements that they can do on their site or near their site, that they would utilize that TIA to determine those things and then build them, getting an offset for their impact fee. So we think it'll make the TIA process more efficient.
I know you said hold questions, but I'm so excited. I just had to jump in. So a developer can't use a TIA, which is a traffic impact analysis, can't use that as a way to lower their impact fees.
Right. I mean, they could, in that they could be demonstrating that they are reducing demand by some sort of transportation demand management measures, but primarily that's going to have been determined up front in the impact fee already. So that TIA is really more to determine how to allocate their impact fee. Like we were talking to a development the other day that the maximum impact fee, and I'll talk a little bit more about this for this development, was really, really high. But then based on the collection rates the city is recommending, I think it was more like 6 million or something. This is a large redevelopment, and but then they had a road through their development that's required under our transportation plan. And we said, well, since you're going to be building that road, you're going to get the, for whatever the cost of that road is, against your impact fee. And so you may actually not have a fee or have a reduced fee because of that. So I think that level of predictability is also helpful to developers. Where our TIA process occurs in the development process is typically at the end when the project is really better scoped. And at that point, that development has typically got all their financing, and it's really, really impactful to the project to all of a sudden having a new cost to that project. And that's why there's such a struggle with developers to not mitigate their impact. So how long has Austin had street impact fees? Well, you are teeing up like my next slide. If we jump to, well, let's go to this slide and then I'll jump to slide 8, which is the schedule. But yes, so what we're doing is within this impact fee study is calculating the cost of growth on street infrastructure. And so to do that, we have to do a study that's required by the state law. It says you need to project the growth that's going to occur over the next 10 years. And then, so you have future land use assumptions, and then you're going to project the corresponding roadway projects that are needed to serve that new growth in those next 10 years. And so that's really the crux of the study that every city would be doing to determine their impact fees. So going to slide 8, this is the schedule slide of where Austin has been on our study. I would say this is not typical of other cities in Texas, but Austin happens to be special when it comes to policy, and it takes us longer, I think, than other cities to get through processes. We started back at the near the end of 2016. We formed our advisory committee that's required by the state. We already had a committee because we had water and wastewater impact fees, and so we use that committee to advise us on this project. We developed those land use assumptions, the roadway capacity plan, and really what caused us to kind of have a longer process is that we were in the middle of updating our transportation plan. We utilized that process to inform the impact fee. So we kind of took a year break while we were waiting for that project to be completed. And now we're in this policy and ordinance review phase. As you can see, we are here at the very end of the timeline.
So you haven't quite adopted them yet. See, the making the case for impact fees for us here in Laredo, you don't have to do that. I mean, we know we need them. The part of your experience that could really help us is the getting them adopted, getting to that, talking to the right people. That's the part the benefit and how it actually works. You know, those are details which I think most of the people in this room will maybe not be directly involved with, but almost everybody here in the room wants to see them adopted, knows that we need them. And that's the process. How do we get that going? How do we connect the right people? How do we build the support among the council and the commission and others in the community, developers especially?
Yep. So, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Our consultants told us you'll spend the majority of your time working on this study, details to come up with a number, and then the council's just going to set a policy somewhere between 0 and that number, right? So you're going to do all this work for ultimately a policy decision, right? And that stakeholder engagement is where that really comes, is really, really important. I think the part that was important about the study that we wanted to make sure was that there weren't challenges to the technical elements of the study, right? We wanted everyone to agree that what staff brought forward was good work, and that there weren't errors in the study, because that would have just put in jeopardy the entire conversation at the policy level. And we also didn't want the development community and others to say, we didn't know this was happening. We are shocked and surprised to hear that this is at City Council. So I did a lot of, I would say, in terms of if anybody out there does public engagement and you think about the spectrum of public engagement to, inform all the way to empower your stakeholders, we're probably more on the informed side, wanting to make sure we were getting information out, keeping people updated, answering questions, me being as available as possible to any group that wanted me to come and present to them. We didn't want people to be able to come to city council and say, I never had an opportunity to learn about this or to provide my feedback. That would be a huge negative. Now, if you don't like it or you don't think that fees should be charged, then that's a whole policy conversation, and that's what city council is for, and why they're left by the voters to make those decisions. But we wanted to make sure that the technical basis and that everybody had their opportunity to understand this project. And since it's been going on for about 4 years, they've had plenty of time.
It's a good strategy, Leanne. Were you here through the whole process, or did you work with Austin through?
I was. I started at Austin Transportation in the fall of 2015, and the staff member that had originally proposed this and got it in our budget that year, the study, he was no longer with the department, and so my boss handed it to me and said, put out an RFQ, hire a consultant, we have to do this study. So
who are your consultants that you used?
Kimley Horn. And they have done throughout the whole process. They have done a lot of impact fee studies in a lot of different cities in Texas. I mean, our experience when we started was that the Metroplex was the place where most of the impact fee programs were, roadway impact fees specifically. Since then, I think Raphael mentioned New Braunfels has a program, the city of Round Rock, the city of Pflugerville.
What was your budget?
Around Austin. Our initial budget was
for Kimley Horn for the
I want to say it was around $1 million. So it was more than, I would say, more than other cities probably have spent. We included money to do some probably more sophisticated financial analysis that's really required. We also ended up doing, as part of that contract, an update to our transportation criteria manual. So I would say baked into that amount is some other things that aren't really necessary for the bare bones of what you actually need to do to conduct the study.
Here's another question. In addition to having consultants, how, of course, you're a lot larger than we are, but how important, well, and I know you probably do more things than just this, but imagine that we don't have anybody like you that's kind of a policy manager in our transportation department or elsewhere. How much of this has taken up your time? In other words, it would inform us to how much of a person dedicated to this do we need, rather than, oh, hey, engineering director or planning director, take this on in addition to the other things you're doing. Is that realistic or is that unrealistic? Is this taking a lot of your time?
I think it ebbs and flows. There's probably a lot of projects. I have taken on more of the stakeholder engagement and even our city council engagement. I would say, Kimley Horn, I could have set them off and they could have done the whole study. So my role was more in managing the process and kind of those external factors that are outside the actual technical requirements of the study. I was also working on the strategic mobility plan at the time, so there was a lot of overlap in those couple of years. But I'm the liaison to the advisory committee, so convening that group and then briefing the council and our management. So at times it's been more intense on my time, but not throughout. It wasn't my dedicated time all 4 years. Definitely not. We also had a sub-consultant on the contract that was to assist us with public engagement. So they helped manage their stakeholder list and email and website content, stuff like that. So definitely had help. And then my understanding from Fort Worth, who's the next biggest city in Texas that has a roadway program, I think they have about 1.5 FTEs that actually administer the program. So that's another thing to consider as well. Once you get once you have the study done, then you actually have to have someone that's going to manage it. And so I don't know who that's going to be in Austin yet. And that's something we're going to have to figure out, is how we're administering this after it's passed. We kind of are laser beam focused on just getting through city council at this point. So, but there's a lot for us to do, after we get through that milestone.
Sorry for the interjected questions. It's
not a problem.
we only have you here for a short time, and you and Rafa have gone through the definition and the process. Really, what we really would love to spend the time on or have the discussion on is, the adoption process.
Yeah, and I can, I can make sure I don't dawdle in the details too long. So thank you. I will letting me know, kind of where you guys are at and what you're interested in. So that's helpful. I'll just breeze through them the next few slides. If you go to the next slide, Raphael, please, on service areas. This is one thing that is really going to be different city to city, and I think also makes a huge impact on the way that the policy is going to be created is where impact fees can be spent. We didn't have to deal with this with water and wastewater because the service area is citywide. So there's one service area, one fee rate for the whole area. With roadways, because of that rational nexus that Raphael talked about, the state law limits the size of the service area to no more than 6 miles. It's kind of like, well, 6 miles, what does exactly that mean? We interpret it to mean no point within the service area from one point to another point is no longer than 6 miles. So kind of a 6 mile diameter area. And so you're cutting your city up into a bunch of different areas that may not align with any other geographies that we have. We have council districts, but those are determined based on population and not because of travel patterns or technical things that you would think of for a roadway impact fee. And so that decision right there, I think, is something that you do want stakeholder involvement in, and will make a difference in your policy at the end of the day. So on the slide 10 is the actual map that we got to with our service areas. So we're at 17, so that's a lot. Smaller cities are obviously going to have fewer. I think the city of Austin is 300 and something square miles. So lots of different areas. And we looked at a lot of different factors, highway boundaries, the regional Campo, our MPO model about travel patterns and trip lengths. We tried to create this loop theme. So our 183, Highway 183, 71 and 360 are these, kind of highways. We have we don't really have a clearly defined inner loop and outer loop like other Texas cities do, but we tried to create this inner loop of service areas that have shorter trip lengths versus service areas on the outer loop that are more suburban and more sprawling, have longer trip lengths. So this has definitely been, especially the downtown being carved out is a discussion. And one other factor to think about is that essentially the boundaries are the center line of the roadway. And so where you have two service areas touching each other, they could be contributing to the same project. And so that's maybe strategically where you would define those to be able to contribute to one project. For instance, in our case, I-35, if the city is contributing ultimately to that project. So the next slide is on the land use assumptions. So we did a whole process to project population and employment projections. As a city, this is something I'm hoping to get to in the future. We have some department that does land use assumptions for the whole city to use, but right now we're kind of going one-off and every project is having to do their own. So our water utility had to do their own land use assumptions for their impact fee study. We did our own. We tried to make them as consistent as possible, and looking at growth rates. So we projected residential and employment square footage and dwelling units on residential over a 10-year period. So since we did this back in 2017, this is 2017 to 2027. And then this growth is allocated within each service area. So on slide 12, I talked about our transportation plan. At the time, we were updating our comprehensive transportation plan for the city. This is important because the state law says that what you can pay for with impact fees are arterial collector roads that have been designated on an officially adopted roadway plan. Our roadway plan at the time was from 1995. Austin had grown quite a bit since then, so we needed to update that transportation plan. And so the strategic mobility plan and projects that were identified there and the right-of-way that was identified in the ASMP was used as the basis for the CIP in the impact fee.
Leanne, question on that.
Yeah.
Right now, our thoroughfare plan, our road infrastructure plan for the city is basically one map. What did you, in any discussion, did you gather it from Kimley Horn or from others that your plan has to be more robust if you're going to use impact fee money to pay for the infrastructure that's on the plan? Did that come up? I mean, was it necessary that you did this plan first to be able to get the impact fees adopted?
It was necessary. It wasn't because there was anything wrong with the complexity of the existing plan that we had. It was that it hadn't been updated to really reflect the city's goals. We had a comprehensive plan in 2012 that was passed that said we want to be a compacted, connected city. We want all these multimodal streets. We passed the complete streets ordinance. We have a Vision Zero goal. Like, all these kind of policy goals were not at all baked into the 1995 plan, which is essentially the city of Austin adopting our MPO's plan at the time. And it really hadn't been maintained or updated since then. And so we were in an old plan with really different city population and projections. So that was why it was necessary for us. We could have used the older plan. It just needed to be an officially adopted roadway plan. So if you had that, you could base your impact fee off of it. You just need to have confidence that those are actually the projects that you want to fund. We didn't have that confidence. So that's why we were pursuing it. So
and going back to, so you arrived in 2015 with the city?
Yeah.
So
with the transportation department.
Were you privy to any of the discussions or the strategy of staff to be able to get that $1 million from council to be able to fund the project, to be able to explore impact fees and then ultimately adopt them? Were you a part of that at all? I mean, what was the strategy?
I wasn't. That budget was passed in August of 2015, and I joined the department in September or October. So no, I didn't have any role in the advocacy. I have seen the presentation when I started this project. I was like, okay, I gotta get up to speed. The presentations that they made about rough proportionality and different things to our planning commission and the council to seed the idea. So happy to share. They're a few years old now, but happy to share their kind of logic that they went through to advocate for it in our budget.
If you still have those presentations, if you can send them to me, I appreciate it.
Yep, I do. But no, I got to be lucky of here's the money, go figure out how to spend it, and hire someone to help us because we don't know how to do this by ourselves. So so we were doing the strategic mobility plan at the same time. It was adopted by our council in the spring of last year. So that was a big milestone. And then getting back to the impact fee program. So in general, I won't cover the next slide, 13, in much detail, but it's important in talking about, when we're going to talk about utility fees with the next presenter. The impact fee, like Raphael said, is specifically for capital improvements related to capacity that are related to new infrastructure. And so it's very explicit what we can and can't pay for. Raphael mentioned transit. That's one element where we agreed we could not pay for a bus, a transit station, those types of elements of the public transportation system, but the elements of the roadway that were a part of the transit system, like certain types of pavement for that high, heavy volume of those heavier vehicles, we included in the cost of those projects where we knew that transit was planned. We can't pay for O&M. You can't pay for upgrades to serve existing developments, only that increment that is for new development. And then you can't really pay for the administrative costs of operating the program. So when you talk about FTEs that you might need, or employees you might need to manage it, you have to think about that as well. You can use the fees to do the study update, which is required every 5 years. So I think probably the first year is the most significant. And then in 5 years, you kind of go back and refresh and make sure that your growth projections and your projects are still accurate. So on the next slide, when you talked about one map of all your projects, that's essentially what we have. We have one map of roadway projects. I don't expect you to be able to read all those in detail, but if you go to austin.texas.gov/ASMP, we have a series of maps. One of them is called the Roadway Capacity Project Map. It's like an interactive web map. and you can see all these different categories, whether they're corridor improvements, access management, expanding a roadway, a highway improvement. And so those are really all of the elements of we called it the roadway capacity plan. It's really the CIP. We just didn't want to confuse this subset of projects with the city's overall CIP program. So, and then also intersection improvements, like signals and turn lanes can be included as well, which is important in an area like our downtown that may not have a lot of room to add additional roadway capacity, but we can make intersection improvements. We can also pay for some for bond projects. So if you're currently paying for a bond program, I think this is one of the things that we've used a lot as a talking point with our stakeholders and our council is you could pay down the debt on your bonds so that you can free that bond revenue or bond capacity up to spend it on other things like other types of transportation improvements like transit or affordable housing or whatever it is that you have that you maybe have fewer tools to pay for than we have on roadway capacity. So the other thing that we were doing on slide 15 at this time, because we had an old transportation plan, we also had an old transportation criteria manual from the 80s. And I'd like to say that, like, oh yeah, we love the 80s and 90s, but they weren't so great for multimodal transportation. So we needed to update our street cross sections. So that was happening at the same time. And this is important when we were talking to stakeholders who are saying, well, we really want to make sure that that these transportation improvements aren't just for cars, and that we understand that this program is constrained to only pay for roadway capacity for cars, but what about our sidewalks and other things? And so the state law allows you to include the necessary appurtenances of the road as part of the project. And so if you have a standard cross section that includes a sidewalk or a bike lane, a street tree, whatever those necessary appurtenances are, those are included in the project cost. So this is also important to update that we had those standards that reflected our current goals. So on slide 16, these were in compilation, the service areas, those land use assumptions, and the roadway capacity plan was the study. And we took to council. They approved it back in August. We didn't have to kind of have this incremental stair step where they approved things, but we wanted to get their agreement as we went along so that we weren't trying to get them to agree to everything all at once. It's better if they've already said, okay, yep, we already agreed that those are the service areas that we want. Because if they wanted to change them now, it would have, we'd have to redo our study, right? So we didn't want to have that decision at the very, very end. And then calculating what the actual fee is on slide 17, there's a formula. Essentially, you're taking, what I like to tell people is you're taking the cost of all the projects and then you're dividing that by the amount of growth. So depending on how many projects you have and how much growth is expected, that's going to determine what your maximum impact fee is. And that's going to be different in every single service area. So in Austin, where we have a lot of areas that are older, that developed a long time ago, there's not a lot of places to add roadway capacity. Those service areas are going to look really different than areas of the city that either developed really quickly and the transportation infrastructure really hasn't caught up, or they just have more needs because of where they are in the city. So this is where we had a lot of variation between the maximums. And so that came into the policy conversation, because do you want different parts of the city to pay different rates because of the amount of infrastructure that they need? And how does that actually impact where development decisions are made? And is that something that you're wanting to influence or not influence as a city? So that's really a policy decision. And really what we're looking at is only the part of the roadway capacity plan, that CIP, that's based on those 10 years. So we can't pay for the part that's based on existing demand, or the demand, the blue section of that graphic is the beyond the 10 years. So you're only looking at that recoverable portion. So on slide 18, ultimately what the study says, you do all this work, and you're just getting to the point where you have a service area, what the maximum is, and then the dollar per vehicle mile. The vehicle mile is the service unit for roadway impact fees. So what is the development unit's generation of vehicle miles is really what you're getting to, and then they're paying the $1 per vehicle mile. And then what is the actual collection rate that the city is going to set? And that
So
could
you're
be
doing a traffic impact analysis for every development that comes in. Is it just commercial, industrial, or residential?
You're essentially doing like a study for every service area, right, to determine what their dollar is. And so then that's kind of almost just a calculation. What development are you building? 200 apartment units at, ITE says trip generation rate is X, and so this is your impact fee.
So you're charging to residential, everything, residential, commercial, industrial, and you're performing the calculation of, I mean, it's not a complex one. You're just using ITE's latest trip generation model, and you're applying the land use, but you're determining the land use categories, or you're proposing to determine them?
Yes. So, and they're out of ITE land use category. So there is some, right, authority that staff would have then to actually determine that the applicant would apply, and you would say, well, actually, you're not this land use, you're this land use. We do have a provision in our ordinance that says, if you don't have an equivalent land use in ITE doesn't have all land uses, that you could provide an alternative calculation to the city to review. So, yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
What at what point in the development process
permits and not pay impact fees? So that was just a policy recommendation that we made to kind of compromise with stakeholders who are saying, oh my gosh, my project has been based on this TIA, now there's going to be this different fee. We recognize that is a challenge. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, just council is determining that collection rate. That's probably the most important thing that they do. The grace period that we were just talking about, that's another important decision. Offsets we talked about a little bit. That's pretty standard, but there are a couple of things, we're allowing for a master plan development that's going to come in phases to negotiate all of their offsets up front. So they know for the whole planning of their project what they're going to get offsets for and what they're not. So that's an agreement that the city would enter into with that development. And then reductions. That's been a lot of conversation at Austin is what types of fee reductions are we providing? So reductions from that collection rate for different types of developments. The state law allows for up to 100% reductions for affordable housing units that qualify. And then we also looked at developments that are reducing their transportation impact in some way. Either they're a mixed use development, they have some sort of internal capture, they are along a transit line, and they're going to have a mode share where some of their tenants are going to be riding transit, or they're providing reduced parking. Those kind of technical reasons that we would say you're actually reducing the demand on the transportation network. So slide 20 is the summary of our staff recommendation. We made on the collection rate a recommendation. I mentioned that the maximum fees were all over the place on the service areas. So we said instead of having different rates in every service area, we recommended a citywide maximum of 50% of that citywide maximum for non-residential land uses and 35% of that citywide maximum for residential land uses. We have a reduction for internal capture up to 20%. Our reductions for transportation demand management strategies are up to 40%, depending on where you are in the city. If you're more accessible to multimodal infrastructure, you're going to have more eligibility for those reductions. We have a small infill, just kind of to recognize that there's some infill redevelopment that's just such a small increase in new trips. We're going to exempt essentially those redevelopments. Affordable housing, the qualifying units would have 100% fee reduction, and that the effective date would be the date of the ordinance adoption, and that we wouldn't collect fees for a year. So,
question on that, Leanne. In states I've worked in that have impact fees, most of the states don't allow a lot of these exemptions. They have to come from the general fund. In other words, there's still a demand on the transportation system with these things, and if the city is choosing to exempt them, they have to pay for that exemption. This has to come; those fees have to come from the general fund. There's nothing like that in Texas that requires that doesn't allow you to exempt?
We have seen that in some city ordinances. It doesn't explicitly say that in the state law. The state law does specifically talk about affordable housing units, so we feel like that one is very clearly authorized by the state. The ones that we really wanted to focus on were those. We didn't want it to be like a policy fee reduction. This is really a reduction because that development is actually reducing their trips, and so that is what that percentage is related to. So they have to follow the procedures in our criteria manual to actually determine those trip reductions to qualify for those fee reductions. So we wanted to make sure that they were very technically tied, but we have heard of, if you wanted to, say our council says, well, we have a special development, want to waive the impact fee for them. We would say,
we got a big industrial development coming in, so we want to incentivize it. So let's not charge them impact fees like that. Typically, that's not allowed in.
Typically, you would be opening yourself up to a legal challenge. I think to do that, you would be jeopardizing your entire program for that one development. And so we would advise our council against that, or say, well, then you need to say then the city is going to contribute. If you're waiving their $5 million impact fee, the city is going to contribute that from some other source to pay for that infrastructure that they are not now funding.
And I'm sorry, I'm just jumping with all these questions. I'm so excited about.
I know we probably need to move on.
Yes,
for
if we
time's
can.
sake. Yeah.
If we can wrap up really quick, maybe in 30 seconds or a minute, and then toss it over to Corpus. We're going to still try to end at 10:30. However, we'll continue it for those that want to stay, but for everybody else, we'll.
Yeah. So all I was going to say is we're on to, we had first reading November 12th. Our council approved our ordinances on first reading, so they're going back in December for second and third reading. So we'll see what happens. That we're kind of in the midst of the decision being made, and so we'll see what happens with our program. But yeah, thanks for your interest. Sorry for talking so long.
This was great. And if you don't mind, Dan, we'd love to continue our conversation with you. Our staff here in Laredo, maybe we can have you down to speak sometime. And so hopefully this is not the last time we hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Leanne, do you want me to move on to another?
Oh, no, I'm handing it back over to you. You can flash up slide 24 is my email. If anybody wants to email me, I can put it in the chat, but I know I've taken up a lot of time. So I would love to pass it over to Corpus to talk about their utility.
Yeah, if you could put your email in the chat, that'd be great.
Sure.
And I guess your presentation always generates a lot of interest. Like we have had Leanne in other workshops, so thank you very much. Okay, so
thank you.
Thank you, Leanne, and now we're moving to the presentation with Corpus Christi, and I'll hand it over to Mr. Martinez and Sarah.